When my family ignored me at Christmas dinner last year, I thought my heart couldn't break any further. But then, the waiter at Romano's Fine Dining whispered something that changed everything. "Your table is ready, Mrs. Billionaire." I had no idea what he meant, but those 5 words would unravel a family secret that had been hidden from me for 37 years and reveal why my own children had been treating me like a stranger in my own home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and until last Christmas, I believed I was just an ordinary widow living on a teacher's pension in suburban Phoenix. My husband, Miguel, had passed away 3 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, leaving me with our modest 2-bedroom house, a 15-year-old Honda Civic, and enough savings to cover my basic expenses if I was careful. What I didn't know was that my entire life had been built on a foundation of lies so elaborate that even I, the person living it, had no idea who I really was. The trouble started in November when my daughter Carmen called to inform me about Christmas dinner plans. Carmen was 34, married to a successful real estate developer named Brad, and they lived in a sprawling house in Scottsdale with their 2 teenage children, Isabella and Diego. My son Roberto, 31, was a software engineer who had recently gotten engaged to his longtime girlfriend, Sophia. Both of my children had always been somewhat distant, but I attributed that to their busy lives and my own tendency toward independence. Carmen's voice on the phone that day was different, though, colder than usual. "Mom, we're doing Christmas dinner at the house this year. Brad's parents are flying in from Denver, and Roberto and Sophia will be there too. Dinner's at 3. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. What can I bring? I could make my famous tres leches cake, or maybe the tamales you used to love when you were little." There was a pause that lasted too long. "Actually, Mom, we've got everything covered. Just bring yourself." Something in her tone made my stomach clench, but I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe she was just stressed about hosting such a large dinner. "Are you sure? I don't mind helping with the cooking." "We're sure. See you at 3. The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone in confusion. In all the years since Miguel's death, I had always contributed something to family gatherings. It was my way of feeling useful, of maintaining my place in the family despite being the widowed mother rather than the wife and grandmother I'd once been. December crawled by with an unusual silence from both children. Usually, Carmen would call at least twice a week to check in, and Roberto would text me funny memes or pictures from his work projects. But as Christmas approached, my phone remained stubbornly quiet. When I tried calling them, Carmen would answer with short, distracted responses, claiming she was too busy to talk. Roberto's calls went straight to voicemail. The morning of Christmas Eve, I decided to drive to Carmen's house with a batch of homemade cookies, thinking perhaps a surprise visit would help me understand what was happening. When I knocked on the front door, I could hear voices and laughter from inside, but no one answered. I knocked again, louder this time, and the voices suddenly stopped. Finally, Carmen opened the door, but only a crack, not inviting me inside. Behind her, I could see unfamiliar faces, people I didn't recognize, laughing and holding wine glasses in what appeared to be a festive gathering. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "I brought cookies for the kids. I thought maybe I could visit for a few minutes." Carmen glanced nervously over her shoulder. "This isn't a good time. We have, Brad's work friends over. It's a business thing." "Oh." I held out the container of cookies, feeling foolish. Well, maybe the kids would like these later. She took the container without opening it. "Thanks. We'll see you at 3, okay?" The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone in confusion. In all the years since Miguel's death, I had always contributed something to family gatherings. It was my way of feeling useful, of maintaining my place in the family despite being the widowed mother rather than the wife and grandmother I'd once been. Christmas morning arrived gray and cold, unusual weather for Phoenix. I sat in my small kitchen drinking coffee and watching the news, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of dread about the dinner ahead. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I spent extra time getting ready, choosing my best dress, the navy blue one with tiny flowers that Miguel had always said made my eyes sparkle. I styled my graying hair carefully and even put on the pearl earrings he had given me for our 20th anniversary. If my family was pulling away from me, I wanted to look my best, to remind them that I was still their mother, still someone worth including. The drive to Carmen's house took 20 minutes through quiet suburban streets, decorated with Christmas lights and inflatable lawn ornaments. Children played with new bicycles in driveways while parents watched from porches, coffee mugs in hand. The normalcy of it all made the knot in my stomach tighten further. When I arrived at Carmen's house at exactly 3 o'clock, I noticed several cars in the driveway I didn't recognize. Through the large front windows, I could see people moving around inside, but the warm glow that usually emanated from family gatherings seemed somehow more formal. I rang the doorbell and waited. Brad answered, looking uncomfortable in his expensive sweater and dress pants. "Elena? Hi? Come on in." The living room was full of people I had never seen before. Well-dressed couples in their 50s and 60s, holding crystal glasses of wine and speaking in the low, confident tones of people accustomed to wealth. My daughter moved through the group like a hostess at a cocktail party, not like someone preparing a family Christmas dinner. "Carmen, honey, where should I put my purse?" She looked up from her conversation with a woman wearing what appeared to be a diamond necklace worth more than my car. "Oh, just put it anywhere, Mom." Roberto was there too, standing near the fireplace with Sophia, both of them dressed far more formally than any Christmas dinner I remembered. When I approached them, Roberto gave me a brief hug that felt obligatory. "Merry Christmas, Mom. You look nice." "Thank you, sweetheart. This is quite a gathering. Are these friends of yours?" Roberto and Sophia exchanged a glance. "They're, family friends. People we've gotten to know through Brad's business." For the next 2 hours, I sat on the edge of conversations I wasn't included in, smiled at people who barely acknowledged my presence, and watched my own family treat me like a distant relative they were obligated to tolerate. The topics of conversation revolved around exotic vacations, investment portfolios, private schools, and country club memberships. I felt like I was eavesdropping on someone else's life. When dinner was finally served, I found myself seated at the far end of the table between Brad's elderly father, who was hard of hearing, and a woman who spent the entire meal discussing her daughter's equestrian competitions. My own grandchildren, Isabella and Diego, sat at the opposite end, engaged in animated conversations with the other guests about things I know nothing about. The food was catered, I realized, not homemade. Everything was perfectly prepared and beautifully presented, but it lacked the warmth and chaos of the family dinners I remembered. No one asked about my teaching career, my volunteer work at the animal shelter, or how I was handling the holidays without Miguel. I might as well have been invisible. After dinner, as people moved back to the living room for coffee and dessert, I excused myself to use the bathroom. Walking down the hallway lined with family photos, I noticed something that stopped me cold. All the pictures were recent, from the last 5 years or so. There were no photos of Miguel and me at family gatherings, no pictures of the children when they were small, nothing that acknowledged the 30-plus years of history we shared as a family. It was as if my entire past with them had been erased. When I returned to the living room, I overheard a fragment of conversation that made my blood freeze. Carmen was speaking quietly to one of the guests, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s. "I know it's awkward having her here, but we couldn't exactly not invite her. Family obligations, you know?"
The casual cruelty of those words hit me like a physical blow. I was a family obligation. My presence at my own daughter's Christmas dinner was an inconvenience they were forced to endure. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at this room full of strangers who were apparently more important to my children than I was. Then I quietly retrieved my purse, slipped out the front door, and drove home in silence. That night, alone in my small house with only the glow of my modest Christmas tree for company, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had I done something wrong? Said something to offend them? I went through every interaction from the past few months searching for clues, but found nothing that could explain such a dramatic shift in how they treated me. The next morning, I called Carmen to thank her for dinner, as I had been raised to do. "Oh, hi, Mom. Thanks for coming yesterday." Her tone was neutral, polite, as if I were an acquaintance I barely knew. "Carmen, honey, is everything all right? I felt like something was off yesterday. Are you upset with me about something?" Another of those long pauses. "Everything's fine, Mom. We're just busy, you know. Brad's business is really taking off, and we're meeting a lot of new people. Our social circle is expanding." "I understand that, but I'm your mother. Surely there's room in your life for both your new friends and your family." "Of course there is. Look, I have to go. The kids have activities today, and I need to get them ready." The conversation ended with the same abrupt dismissal I had been receiving for weeks. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the holidays were stressful for everyone, that things would go back to normal after the new year. But they didn't. January went and came with minimal contact from either child. February brought Isabella's 15th birthday, an event I learned about from a photo on Carmen's social media rather than an invitation. March brought news of Roberto's promotion at work, information I discovered when a neighbor mentioned seeing it in the local business journal. By April, I was forced to acknowledge that something fundamental had changed in my relationship with my children, and I had no idea what or why. They weren't angry with me, at least not in any way they were willing to discuss. They simply seemed to have decided that I was no longer relevant to their lives.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The isolation was devastating. Without Miguel to share my concerns with, without my children to provide the connection and purpose that had sustained me through widowhood, I found myself questioning everything about my life. Had I been a bad mother? Had I somehow failed to prepare them for success in ways that made them ashamed of their upbringing? It was during this period of self-doubt and loneliness that I received a phone call that would begin to unravel the mystery of my family's sudden rejection. The call came on a rainy Thursday evening in May. I was grading papers at my kitchen table, trying to distract myself from another day of silence from Carmen and Roberto, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Elena Rodriguez?" The voice was unfamiliar, an older man with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Yes, this is Elena. Who's calling, please?" "My name is David Ashworth. I'm an attorney with Ashworth, Pemberton and Associates here in Phoenix. I represent the estate of Victoria Castellanos. Are you familiar with that name?" I frowned, searching my memory. "No, I don't think so. Should I be?" There was a pause. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I think we need to meet in person. There are some matters regarding Ms. Castellanos' estate that directly concern you. Would you be available to come to my office tomorrow afternoon?" "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong person. I don't know anyone named Victoria Castellanos, and I can't imagine why her estate would have anything to do with me." "Mrs. Rodriguez, I understand your confusion, but I assure you this is legitimate. Ms. Castellanos passed away 3 months ago, and her will specifically names you as a beneficiary. The matters we need to discuss are quite substantial and time-sensitive." My heart started racing. "A beneficiary? That's impossible. There must be some mistake." "I have your full name, Elena Maria Rodriguez, formerly Elena Maria Sandoval, married to Miguel Rodriguez in 1987,
currently residing at 4247 Desert Rose Lane in Phoenix. Is this information correct? It was all correct, but that only made the situation more confusing. Yes, but I still don't understand. Mrs. Rodriguez, without going into details over the phone, I can tell you that Ms. Castellanos has left you a very substantial inheritance. However, there are conditions attached that we need to discuss in person. Can you come to my office tomorrow at 2 o'clock? I agreed to the meeting, though I spent the rest of the evening and most of the night trying to figure out who Victoria Castellanos could be and why she would leave me anything in her will. The name meant absolutely nothing to me. I had never known anyone by that name, had never heard it mentioned by Miguel or anyone else in my family. The law office of Ashworth, Pemberton and Associates was located in downtown Phoenix, in a gleaming glass tower that made me feel underdressed in my simple blouse and slacks. The receptionist was polite but professional, directing me to a conference room where David Ashworth waited with a stack of documents that seemed several inches thick. David Ashworth was exactly what I had expected from his voice. A distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive suit. He stood when I entered, extending his hand with a warm smile. Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for coming. Please have a seat. I know this must all seem very mysterious. I settled into the leather chair across from him, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Mr. Ashworth, I've been thinking about this all night, and I'm certain there's been some mistake. I don't know anyone named Victoria Castellanos. I understand, and that's exactly what we need to discuss. He opened the thick folder and withdrew a photograph, sliding it across the table to me. Mrs. Rodriguez, have you ever seen this woman before? The photograph showed an elegant woman in her 80s, with silver hair styled in a sophisticated chignon and wearing what appeared to be expensive jewelry. Her face was lined but still beautiful, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen them. I studied the photo carefully, searching my memory. She looks familiar somehow, but I can't place her. Who was she? Victoria Castellanos was one of the wealthiest women in Arizona. She owned a chain of luxury hotels, several real estate development companies, and had significant investments in technology and pharmaceutical companies. Her net worth at the time of her death was estimated at just over $2 billion. The number hit me like a physical blow. $2 billion? And you said she left me something in her will? Mrs. Rodriguez, Victoria Castellanos left you everything. The conference room seemed to spin around me. I'm sorry, what did you say? Her entire estate. Every hotel, every company, every investment, every piece of property. All of it now belongs to you, with the exception of some specific charitable donations and bequests to employees. David Ashworth leaned forward, his expression serious. Mrs. Rodriguez, as of 3 months ago, you became one of the wealthiest women in the southwestern United States. I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. That's impossible! There has to be a mistake. I'm a retired elementary school teacher. I live in a tiny house and drive a 15-year-old car. Billionaires don't just leave their fortunes to random strangers. You're not a random stranger, Mrs. Rodriguez. Victoria Castellanos was your biological mother. The words hung in the air between us like a bomb that hadn't yet exploded. I felt my mouth open and close, but no sound came out. Finally, I managed to whisper, "What did you say?" I know this is a shock, but we have extensive documentation. Victoria Castellanos gave birth to a daughter in 1963 in Los Angeles. That daughter was given up for adoption through a private agency and placed with Carlos and Maria Sandoval in Phoenix. That daughter was you. My entire world tilted sideways. The parents who had raised me, the people I had called Mama and Papa until they died, weren't my biological parents. The poverty I had grown up in, the struggles my adoptive parents had faced to provide for me, the modest life I had always lived, all of it could have been different if I had known the truth. Why didn't she contact me? If she was my mother, why did she give me up and then leave me money after she died? David Ashworth's expression grew sad. From what I understand, Victoria was very young when she had you, only 17. Her family was traditional and wealthy, and an unmarried pregnancy would have been a scandal. They sent her away to have the baby and insisted on the adoption. By the time she was old enough and independent enough to search for you, the adoption records had been sealed. But she found me eventually. She hired private investigators about 15 years ago. She's been watching over you from a distance, making sure you were safe and happy. She knew about your marriage to Miguel, your children, your career as a teacher. She was immensely proud of the life you built. I thought about the past 15 years, searching for any sign that someone had been watching me. Did she ever try to contact me? She wanted to, but she was afraid of disrupting your life. She knew you had a family, a career, a community. She didn't want to create chaos by suddenly appearing and claiming to be your mother. Her plan was to leave you the inheritance as a way of ensuring your security after she was gone. She's been watching me for 15 years and I never knew? The magnitude of what I was learning was overwhelming. Does anyone else know about this? My children? My husband? According to her instructions, no one was to be informed until after her death and the reading of the will. However, Mrs. Rodriguez, there's something else we need to discuss. Something about your children. My heart stopped. What about my children? David Ashworth reached into the folder again and withdrew another set of documents. 3 months ago, around the time of Victoria's death, your daughter Carmen and your son Roberto were contacted by representatives of the estate. They were informed of your inheritance and offered a choice. What kind of choice? They could either maintain their relationship with you, knowing that you would eventually inherit billions of dollars, or they could accept a one-time payment of $5 million each in exchange for severing all contact with you permanently. The conference room went silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. They were paid to abandon me? Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but yes.
Your children accepted the money, the change in their behavior toward you, the distance, the exclusion from family events. It was all calculated. They were positioning themselves to claim that they had no ongoing relationship with you, so they could keep the money without any legal complications. Everything clicked into place. The cold Christmas dinner, the sudden distance, the way they had treated me like a stranger in my own family. It hadn't been about anything I had done wrong. It had been about money. My own children had sold me for $5 million each. But why would the estate make such an offer? Why would they want to separate me from my family? David Ashworth looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Rodriguez, I need to be completely honest with you. This wasn't a decision made by the estate. This was a test. A test? Victoria Castellanos was a shrewd businesswoman, but she was also someone who had been abandoned by her own family when she needed them most. She wanted to know what kind of people your children were before you inherited billions of dollars. She wanted to see if they would choose money over family, comfort over loyalty. And they did. Yes, they did. Mrs. Rodriguez, I know this is incredibly painful, but Victoria believed that if your children could be bought so easily, they would only cause you pain and exploitation once they learned about your wealth. She saw this as protecting you from people who would use you for your money, even if those people were your own children. I sat in the leather chair in that expensive conference room, trying to process the fact that my entire understanding of my life had been wrong. I wasn't a poor widow struggling to make ends meet. I was a billionaire whose children had abandoned me for money without even knowing I was about to become wealthier than they could imagine.
"What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now, you need to decide how you want to move forward. The inheritance is yours regardless of what your children did. You can choose to reconnect with them, knowing what you now know about their motivations, or you can choose to build a new life without them." Victoria left detailed instructions for either scenario. She planned for this. She knew they would take the money. She hoped they wouldn't, but yes, she planned for the possibility. Mrs. Rodriguez, Victoria spent the last 15 years of her life learning everything she could about you. She knew you were kind, generous, hardworking, and loyal. She also knew that those qualities could make you vulnerable to people who might take advantage of your wealth. She wanted to protect you, even from your own family if necessary. I looked down at my hands, at the simple wedding ring I still wore 3 years after Miguel's death, at the fingernails that were clean but unpolished, at the hands of a woman who had lived her entire life in modest circumstances. Tomorrow, those same hands would sign papers making me one of the richest people in Arizona. "Mr. Ashworth, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think she was right? Do you think my children would have tried to use me if they had known about the inheritance?" David Ashworth was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I can't speak to your children's character beyond what I've observed in this situation. What I can tell you is that Victoria Castellanos was a remarkably good judge of character. It's one of the reasons she was so successful in business. She studied people, understood their motivations, predicted their behavior. And in this case, her prediction was accurate. They chose the money. They chose the money. I sat there in the silence of that conference room, mourning not just the loss of my relationship with my children, but the loss of my entire identity. The life I thought I had lived, the family I thought I belonged to, the future I thought I faced, all of it had been built on incomplete information. But there was something else growing in the space where my grief lived, something that felt like possibility, like freedom, like the chance to discover who Elena Rodriguez really was when she wasn't constrained by financial worry or family obligation. "Mr. Ashworth, what would Victoria have wanted me to do?" He smiled for the first time since I had arrived. "She would have wanted you to live, Mrs. Rodriguez. She would have wanted you to travel, to experience luxury, to be generous with others the way you've always been generous with the little you had. She would have wanted you to find people who valued you for who you are, not what you can give them. And my children? That's entirely up to you."
But Mrs. Rodriguez, I will say this. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not the people who wronged you. Whether you choose to rebuild those relationships or not, don't let their choices define the rest of your life. As I left the law office that afternoon, walking out into the Arizona sunshine with a briefcase full of documents that made me a billionaire, I thought about the waiter at Romano's Fine Dining who somehow knew who I was before I knew it myself. I thought about Christmas dinner and the way my family had treated me like an obligation. I thought about Victoria Castellanos, the mother I never knew I had, who had spent 15 years watching over me from a distance. And for the first time in months, I smiled. The first thing I did after leaving David Ashworth's office was drive to the grocery store where I had shopped for 23 years and buy the most expensive bottle of wine they had. It cost $47, more than I had ever spent on alcohol in my life, and I drank it alone that evening while sitting on my small back patio, trying to comprehend that I could now afford to buy the entire liquor store if I wanted to. The documents spread across my kitchen table told a story that seemed like fiction. Property deeds for luxury hotels in Sedona, Tucson, and San Diego. Stock certificates for companies I had heard of but never imagined owning.
bank statements showing balances with so many zeros that I had to count them twice to believe them. According to the paperwork, I now owned a mansion in Paradise Valley worth $12 million, a penthouse in downtown Phoenix, and a vacation home in Carmel, California that overlooked the Pacific Ocean. But the most surreal part wasn't the money or the properties. It was the thick folder labeled Elena that contained 15 years' worth of reports from private investigators documenting my daily life. Photos of me walking into my small elementary school each morning, carrying my canvas bag full of graded papers and classroom supplies. Images of me grocery shopping, choosing the generic brands and using coupons I had clipped from the Sunday newspaper. Pictures of Miguel and me at our favorite Mexican restaurant, celebrating our anniversary with margaritas and sharing a plate of enchiladas because we couldn't afford to order separate entrees. Victoria Castellanos had been watching me live a modest, careful life while she possessed the resources to change everything for me. The investigators' reports noted my volunteer work at the animal shelter, my habit of bringing homemade soup to elderly neighbors when they were sick, my practice of staying after school without pay to tutor students who were struggling. They documented a life lived with kindness and frugality, a woman who gave generously despite having little to spare. Reading about my own life through the eyes of strangers was disturbing, but what bothered me more was discovering how closely Victoria had monitored my relationships with Carmen and Roberto. The reports noted every family gathering, every phone call, every birthday celebration. They tracked my children's careers, their marriages, their financial situations, their social circles. Victoria had known about Brad's real estate success, about Roberto's promotion, about my grandchildren's private school tuition and piano lessons. She had watched me struggle to afford Christmas gifts for Isabella and Diego while their parents spent thousands of dollars on ski vacations and country club memberships. She had seen me carefully budget for gas money to attend Roberto's engagement party, while Carmen posted photos of weekend trips to Las Vegas and expensive shopping sprees. Victoria had observed my children living increasingly lavish lifestyles while their mother clipped coupons and shopped at thrift stores. The revelation that explained everything came in a report dated 6 months earlier. The private investigator had discovered that Carmen and Roberto had been discussing my financial situation with their spouses and friends, expressing frustration that their inheritance prospects were limited to my modest house and minimal savings. There were documented conversations where they complained about having to eventually support me in my old age, worried about the burden I would become as I required more medical care and assistance. They had been viewing me as a financial liability rather than a beloved parent. When Victoria's representatives contacted them about the inheritance test, they didn't hesitate. $5 million each was more money than they expected to inherit from me over my entire lifetime. The choice, from their perspective, had been simple arithmetic. Take the guaranteed money now and cut ties with the poor mother who would eventually need their support, or maintain a relationship with someone they saw as a financial drain who might live for another 20 years. They chose the money because they had already written me off as worthless. That realization hurt more than the initial abandonment. I could have understood if they were genuinely struggling financially and needed the money for their families. I could have forgiven desperation or fear about their children's futures. But the investigators' reports showed comfortable middle-class families who owned expensive homes, took regular vacations, and sent their children to private schools. They hadn't needed the money. They had simply wanted it more than they wanted me. The next morning brought the first of many bewildering experiences that would define my new reality. David Ashworth called to inform me that a team of financial advisors, estate managers, and personal assistants were being assembled to help me navigate my new circumstances. Within hours, my modest kitchen was invaded by a parade of professionals carrying briefcases and tablets, each one eager to explain some aspect of my newfound wealth. Margaret Chen, the estate manager, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who spoke in rapid-fire sentences about property management, staff oversight, and maintenance schedules. She explained that I now employed over 300 people across various businesses and properties, from hotel maids and groundskeepers to corporate executives and investment analysts. Every decision I made would affect their livelihoods, their families, their futures.
James Morrison, the financial advisor, spread investment portfolios across my kitchen table like a card dealer, explaining dividend payments, growth projections, and tax implications. He told me that my wealth was generating approximately $700,000 in passive income every week, more money than I had earned in my entire teaching career, flowing into my accounts every 7 days without any effort on my part. Dr. Sarah Williams, the personal physician Victoria had retained, wanted to schedule comprehensive health screenings and discuss preventative care options, now that cost was no longer a consideration. She mentioned specialists in Switzerland, experimental treatments, and luxury medical facilities that I could access whenever needed. The parade of professionals continued throughout the day, each one outlining responsibilities and opportunities I had never imagined. By evening, my head was spinning with information about charitable foundations, political contributions, social obligations, and lifestyle management. The simple life I had known for 60 years was being replaced by a complex web of decisions and dependencies that seemed overwhelming. But the most shocking moment came when Margaret Chen handed me some keys and an address in Paradise Valley. "This is your primary residence now, Mrs. Rodriguez. The house has been maintained and staffed according to Victoria's instructions, waiting for your arrival. Your belongings can be moved tomorrow if you're ready." I stared at the keys, heavy and ornate, clearly expensive hardware for an expensive home. What about my house, the place where I've lived for 23 years? "You can keep it, of course, or sell it or donate it. That's entirely your decision. But the Paradise Valley estate has security, staff, and amenities that will make your transition easier. It's also where Victoria lived, so you might find some answers there about your mother and her life."
That evening, I drove through the gates of the most exclusive neighborhood in Arizona to see the house that was now mine. The mansion sat on 5 acres of perfectly manicured desert landscape with mountain views that stretched to the horizon. The Spanish colonial architecture was elegant and imposing, with hand-painted tiles, wrought iron details, and a central courtyard featuring a fountain that probably cost more than my annual teacher salary. Inside, the house was a museum of luxury I had only seen in magazines. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, artwork that looked like it belonged in galleries, furniture that was clearly antique and priceless. But what struck me most was how lived in it felt, despite its grandeur. This wasn't a showplace designed to impress visitors. It was a home where someone had been comfortable, where books were left open on side tables, where family photos lined the mantelpiece. And there, among the photographs of Victoria at various stages of her life, were pictures of me, images I had never seen before, taken with telephoto lenses from great distances, showing me at moments when I had no idea I was being watched. Me laughing at Roberto's college graduation. Me crying at Miguel's funeral. Me playing with Isabella and Diego at the park. Me grading papers at my kitchen table late at night. Victoria had been collecting a visual diary of my life, creating a gallery of the daughter she couldn't acknowledge. The master bedroom contained Victoria's personal effects, and Margaret Chen had explained that I should feel free to explore everything, to learn about the woman who had given me life and then watched over me from afar. Her closet was filled with designer clothes in my exact size, as if she had been preparing for the day when I might need them. Her jewelry collection included pieces that could have funded small countries, but also simple items like a charm bracelet with pendants marking occasions in my life that she had somehow known about. The most moving discovery was Victoria's desk, where she had kept what appeared to be unsent letters to me, dated over the past 15 years. Handwritten notes expressing her pride in my accomplishments, her concern during difficult times, her love for the grandchildren she had never been allowed to meet. Letters apologizing for the choices that had kept us apart, explaining her reasons for watching from a distance, sharing details about her own life that she wished she could have told me in person. One letter, dated just 2 months before her death, contained instructions for the inheritance test involving my children. Victoria had written, "Elena has given her whole heart to those children, sacrificed everything for their happiness and success. If they can so easily abandon her for money,
then they will only bring her pain when they discover her wealth. I pray I am wrong about them, but if I am right, then this test will spare her years of manipulation and heartbreak. She deserves to be loved for who she is, not what she can provide. Reading those words in Victoria's careful handwriting, I realized that the test hadn't been cruel. It had been protective. She had seen what I couldn't see, that my children's love was conditional, that their loyalty had a price. By offering them money to abandon me, she had revealed their true character before I became vulnerable to their greed and manipulation. But the most shocking letter was one addressed to Miguel, dated 3 years ago, just after his death. Victoria had written to my deceased husband, expressing her gratitude for the way he had loved and cared for me, her regret that she had never been able to thank him in person, her promise to watch over me now that he was gone. She had somehow known about his heart attack within days of it happening, had attended his funeral from a distance, had grieved for the man who had been the father she couldn't be. That night, I slept in Victoria's bed, surrounded by the luxury she had enjoyed and the evidence of the love she had harbored for me throughout my life. For the first time since learning about the inheritance, I felt connected to the woman who had made it all possible. I wasn't just a recipient of her generosity. I was her daughter, the child she had always wanted to know. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal documents, property transfers, and lifestyle adjustments that seemed to happen without my conscious participation. Professional movers packed up my modest belongings and transported them to the mansion, where they looked tiny and shabby along Victoria's elegant furnishings. My 15-year-old Honda was replaced by a fleet of luxury vehicles that I was afraid to drive. My simple wardrobe was supplemented by designer clothes that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a year. But the most difficult adjustment was learning to navigate the social expectations that came with extreme wealth. Margaret Chen scheduled charity events, gallery openings, and society fundraisers that I was expected to attend as Victoria's successor. These gatherings were populated by people who had known Victoria well, who expected me to seamlessly step into her role as a philanthropist and social leader. The learning curve was steep and often humiliating. I attended a museum gala wearing a $20,000 dress and had no idea which fork to use for the salad course. I was introduced to politicians, business leaders, and celebrities who assumed I shared their knowledge of current events, market trends, and social gossip. I smiled and nodded through conversations about private jets, European art auctions, and exclusive resorts, feeling like an imposter in designer clothing. The irony wasn't lost on me that my children, who had abandoned me because they thought I was a financial burden, were now living their modest, upper-middle-class lives while I attended parties where people discussed spending their pocket change on items worth more than houses. But the most painful moments came when well-meaning acquaintances asked me about my family. Society matrons who had known Victoria would inquire about my children, expecting proud grandmother stories about accomplished offspring. I learned to deflect these questions with vague responses about busy schedules and distant relationships, unwilling to explain that my son and daughter had sold me for money they didn't even need.
3 months into my new life, I was attending a charity auction for children's literacy when I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. "Did you hear about Elena Rodriguez?" one woman was saying to another. "Victoria Castellano's long-lost daughter? Apparently her own children disowned her when they found out about the inheritance. Can you imagine your own mother becomes a billionaire and you cut ties with her for money?" "I heard it was some kind of test," the other woman replied. "Victoria wanted to see if they were worthy of Elena's love. Apparently they weren't. Those poor children must be dying of regret now." $5 million probably seemed like a fortune at the time, but compared to $2 billion, they made a terrible bargain. As I listened to strangers discuss my family's private tragedy as if it were entertainment, I realized that my story had become part of Phoenix society gossip.
The details were surprisingly accurate, suggesting that someone with inside knowledge had been sharing information about the inheritance test and its results. The conversation also revealed something I hadn't considered. My children might not be living with their decision as comfortably as I had assumed. $5 million was indeed a significant amount of money, but it wasn't generational wealth. It wasn't private jet and luxury yacht money.
It was nice house and a good neighborhood money, expensive car and exotic vacation money. They had traded their relationship with me for an upgrade in lifestyle, not a transformation into genuine wealth. Meanwhile, I was learning that $2 billion was a responsibility as much as an opportunity. Victoria's businesses required oversight and decision-making that affected hundreds of employees and thousands of customers. Her charitable foundation distributed millions of dollars annually to causes throughout Arizona and beyond. Her real estate investments influenced development patterns that shaped entire communities. I was no longer just Elena Rodriguez, retired teacher. I was Elena Rodriguez, business owner, philanthropist, and economic force. Every decision I made had consequences that rippled through industries and communities. The weight of that responsibility was both thrilling and terrifying. But what I discovered in those first months of extraordinary wealth was that money didn't automatically solve the fundamental human need for connection and purpose. I could afford any luxury, travel anywhere, buy anything, but I still woke up alone in a mansion filled with beautiful objects that had no emotional significance. I could attend glittering parties and charity galas, but I still went home to silence and emptiness. The staff Victoria had employed were professional and courteous, but they weren't family. The society friends who welcomed me into their circle were pleasant companions for public events, but they weren't confidants who knew my heart. The financial advisors and property managers who surrounded me with expertise were solving problems I never knew I had, but they weren't addressing the loneliness that had driven me to tears during that devastating Christmas dinner. It was during this period of adjustment and reflection that I decided to test whether my children's abandonment was truly permanent or if there might be room for reconciliation. I missed Isabella and Diego desperately, and I wondered if Carmen and Roberto might be experiencing their own regrets about the choices they had made. I instructed David Ashworth to have their lawyers contacted with an offer. I would be willing to meet with them to discuss rebuilding our relationship. I wouldn't ask them to return the money they had accepted, and I wouldn't make their inheritance dependent on renewed contact with me. I simply wanted to know if there was any possibility of restoring our family bonds, now that the financial pressures had been resolved. The response came back within a week, and it was devastating in its coldness and finality. Through their attorneys, Carmen and Roberto declined any meeting or communication. They stated that they were satisfied with their current circumstances and had no interest in pursuing a relationship with me under any conditions. They requested that I not attempt to contact them directly and warned that any approach to their children would be considered harassment. The legal language was formal and distant, but the message was clear. They had made their choice and were comfortable with it. Whatever love they had felt for me had been genuine enough to sell, but not precious enough to reclaim. That night, sitting in Victoria's study, surrounded by the letters she had written to me but never sent, I finally understood the depth of my mother's wisdom. She had protected me from years of manipulation, false reconciliations, and conditional love by forcing my children to reveal their true priorities before I became vulnerable to their schemes. But understanding Victoria's protection didn't ease the grief of losing Carmen and Roberto. If anything, it made the loss more profound, because it confirmed that their abandonment was a reflection of who they truly were, not a temporary mistake driven by desperation or confusion. I grieved not just for the relationship I had lost, but for the relationship I had thought I had. The loving children I believed I had raised, the family bonds I thought were unbreakable, the legacy of values I believed I had passed down. All of it had been an illusion based on incomplete information about my children's character. Yet, as the months passed and I grew more comfortable with my new circumstances,
I began to discover unexpected sources of joy and connection. The staff at Victoria's hotels welcomed me with warmth and genuine affection, sharing stories about Victoria's kindness and generosity as an employer. The beneficiaries of her charitable foundation sent letters expressing gratitude for programs that had changed their lives. Former business associates reached out to share memories of Victoria's integrity and vision, helping me understand the woman whose legacy I had inherited. Slowly, I was building a new understanding of family that wasn't based on blood relationships or legal obligations, but on shared values and mutual respect. The people who had truly known Victoria saw qualities in me that reminded them of her, and they welcomed me not because of what I could give them, but because of who I was becoming. It was during this gradual healing process that I received a phone call that would change everything once again. The caller identified himself as Marcus Romano, manager of Romano's Fine Dining, the restaurant where this entire journey began, when a waiter somehow knew to call me Mrs. Billionaire before I knew it myself. Marcus Romano's voice carried an urgency that cut through my afternoon routine of reviewing hotel management reports. I had been sitting in Victoria's study, still learning to think of it as my study, when his call interrupted the financial spreadsheets scattered across the mahogany desk. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I apologize for calling you directly, but I felt you should know about something that happened at the restaurant today, something involving your family." My heart clenched at the mention of Carmen and Roberto. Despite their attorney's clear message about wanting no contact, I still harbored a foolish hope that they might change their minds, that they might reach out to repair the damage they had caused. "What happened, Marcus?" "Your daughter Carmen made a reservation for dinner tonight, a large party celebrating something she called a financial milestone. But, Mrs. Rodriguez, there's something you should know about why my waiter recognized you that night, 6 months ago when this all started." The memory of that Christmas dinner felt like a lifetime ago, but I could still recall the moment when the young man had whispered, "Your table is ready, Mrs. Billionaire," as if he somehow knew secrets about my life that I didn't know myself. I don't understand. How did he know who I was? Marcus took a deep breath before answering. "Mrs. Rodriguez, Romano's Fine Dining has been owned by Victoria Castellanos for the past 8 years. She purchased it specifically because it was your favorite restaurant for special occasions. Every staff member was instructed to watch for you, to treat you with exceptional care, and to report back about your visits." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Victoria had been orchestrating my experiences, even in the smallest details of my life. The restaurant where Miguel and I had celebrated anniversaries, where I had taken the children for graduation dinners, where I had felt sophisticated and special despite our modest budget. It had all been another form of her distant care. She owned Romano's because of me?
She bought it after her investigators reported that you and your husband came here twice a year, always ordering the same meals, always saving up for months to afford it. She wanted to ensure that you were treated like royalty during those special occasions, even though you could never know why. I closed my eyes, remembering Miguel's delight at the exceptional service we always received, how the staff seemed to remember our preferences from visit to visit, how we were occasionally surprised with complimentary desserts or upgrades to better wine. We had attributed it to being longtime customers, never imagining that the restaurant's owner was my biological mother, ensuring our happiness from the shadows. "Marcus, what does this have to do with Carmen's reservation tonight?" "Mrs. Rodriguez, I think you should be here, not to confront them, but to see for yourself what kind of celebration they're having, to understand who they really are when they think no one is watching." The suggestion both terrified and intrigued me. I hadn't seen my children in person since that disastrous Christmas dinner, hadn't heard their voices except through lawyers declining reconciliation. The thought of being in the same room with them filled me with a mixture of longing and dread. I don't know if that's a good idea. They made it clear they don't want any contact with me. "Mrs. Rodriguez, the restaurant has private dining rooms with one-way glass. You could observe without being seen. Victoria used to do the same thing when you came for dinner with your family."
She would sit in the manager's office and watch you enjoy your meals, so proud of the life you had built but unable to join you. The image of Victoria watching me through glass, loving me from a distance, celebrating my happiness while remaining forever separate from it, broke my heart. But it also awakened a fierce curiosity about what Carmen and Roberto were truly like when they thought they were free from any consequences or observation. What time is the reservation? 7 o'clock. The Sunset Room, our largest private dining space. Mrs. Rodriguez, there's something else you should know. They've invited 30 people to the celebration, and they've requested our most expensive wine service. The bill for tonight's dinner will exceed $20,000. $20,000? More than I used to earn in 4 months of teaching. Carmen and Roberto were spending more on a single meal than I had often spent on groceries in an entire year. Did they say what they were celebrating? Marcus hesitated. They told our event coordinator it was a liberation celebration. They said they had recently freed themselves from family obligations that had been holding them back financially and socially. The words hit me like shards of glass. A liberation celebration. They were toasting their decision to abandon me, celebrating the money they had gained by severing our relationship. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. I'll be there, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. But I want to understand the arrangements Victoria made for watching me. I want to see what she saw. 3 hours later, I sat in the manager's office at Romano's Fine Dining, looking through one-way glass into the Sunset Room where my children were hosting their liberation celebration. Marcus had explained that Victoria had commissioned the installation of this viewing system, wanting to observe my special occasions without intruding on them. The setup allowed her to see and hear everything that happened in the main dining rooms, a secret window into the life of the daughter she couldn't acknowledge. The office was comfortable and elegant, with leather chairs and soft lighting that made it feel like a luxury theater box. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal where Victoria had apparently recorded her observations from these clandestine viewings. Marcus had given me permission to read it, saying that Victoria had left instructions for me to have access to everything after her death. The journal entries were heartbreaking in their tenderness and detail. Victoria had documented every visit Miguel and I had made to the restaurant, describing our conversations, our laughter, our obvious love for each other. She had noted when I wore my best dress, when Miguel surprised me with flowers, when we splurged on an appetizer because we were celebrating something special. She had been a silent witness to our happiness, treasuring moments that she could only experience secondhand. One entry from 3 years ago, dated just after Miguel's funeral, contained a single line. Elena came alone today for the first time. She ordered Miguel's favorite dish and cried quietly through the entire meal. My heart breaks for the daughter I cannot comfort. As I read Victoria's words, the Sunset Room began filling with guests for Carmen and Roberto's celebration. I recognized some faces from that terrible Christmas dinner, the well-dressed strangers who had been more important to my children than their own mother. But there were also people I had never seen before, couples who appeared to be of Carmen and Roberto's generation, presumably new friends they had acquired since their financial windfall. Carmen arrived wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly teacher pension. She moved through the room with a confidence I had never seen in her before, accepting congratulations and air kisses from guests who seemed eager to celebrate whatever milestone had brought them together. Roberto appeared equally transformed, sporting an expensive watch and designer suit that gave him an air of sophistication he had never possessed during our family gatherings. But it was their body language that struck me most. They carried themselves like people who had been liberated from a burden, who had shed something heavy and restrictive that had been holding them back. The relief in their postures was unmistakable. As the evening progressed and wine loosened tongues, I began to understand the true nature of their celebration. Through the audio system Victoria had installed, I could hear their conversations with devastating clarity. The best part, Carmen was saying to a group of women gathered around the bar, is not having to pretend anymore. Do you know how exhausting it was to maintain a relationship with someone who just didn't fit into our lives? Someone who reminded us of where we came from instead of where we were going? One of her friends, a blonde woman in her 30s, laughed sympathetically. I can't imagine having to explain your mother's little house and old car to people at the country club. How embarrassing for you.
Exactly. Carmen's voice carried across the room with an enthusiasm that made my stomach turn. She was like this anchor dragging us down. Every family gathering was just a reminder of poverty and limitation. And the way she would try to contribute to conversations about travel or investments when she'd never been anywhere or owned anything significant. It was mortifying. Roberto had found his own audience near the window, where he was holding court with several men who appeared to be business associates. The thing people don't understand about family obligations, he was saying, is that sometimes you have to make difficult choices for the greater good. We could have continued enabling her dependence on us, but that wouldn't have been healthy for anyone involved. So you just cut her off completely? One of the men asked. We provided her with the resources to become independent, Roberta replied smoothly. Sometimes tough love is the most compassionate choice. She needed to learn to stand on her own instead of relying on her children for emotional and financial support. The casual rewriting of history was stunning. In Roberto's version of events, they had been generous benefactors helping me achieve independence, rather than children who had sold their relationship with their mother for money they didn't need. But the most revealing moment came when Carmen's husband Brad stood up to make a toast. The room fell silent as he raised his glass, and I leaned forward to catch every word. I want to thank Carmen and Roberto for having the courage to make a difficult but necessary decision 6 months ago, when they were presented with the opportunity to secure their family's financial futures while freeing themselves from a relationship that had become more obligation than joy. They chose wisely. The guests murmured approval, raising their glasses in solidarity. Tonight, we celebrate not just their financial success, but their emotional liberation. Carmen and Roberto are living proof that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is knowing when to walk away from relationships that no longer serve your highest good, even when those relationships are with family. The applause that followed was enthusiastic and sustained. 30 people toasting my children's decision to abandon me, treating their betrayal as if it were a triumph of personal growth and boundary setting. As I watched my son and daughter beam with pride at their husband's words, accepting congratulations for their courage in discarding me, I felt something inside my chest crystallize into cold, hard clarity. This wasn't the behavior of children who had made a difficult choice under pressure. This wasn't the conduct of people who felt conflicted or guilty about their decision. This was the celebration of individuals who felt genuinely relieved to be free from the burden of loving me. The evening continued with elaborate courses and increasingly expensive wines. I watched my children laugh and socialize with people who admired their ruthlessness, who saw their abandonment of me as evidence of sophisticated boundary setting rather than callous greed. The liberation they were celebrating wasn't just financial, it was emotional. They had freed themselves from the inconvenience of having a mother who didn't enhance their social status or contribute to their networking opportunities. Near the end of the dinner, as dessert was being served, Carmen stood up to make her own toast. The room quieted again, and I braced myself for whatever revelation was coming. 6 months ago, Roberto and I faced a choice that would define the rest of our lives, she began, her voice clear and confident. We could continue living in the shadow of our upbringing, limited by circumstances we didn't choose, or we could embrace an opportunity to create the future we deserved. She paused for dramatic effect, looking around the room at faces that hung on her every word. Some people might judge our decision. They might say that family should come before money, that blood is thicker than water, that we owed loyalty to someone simply because of biological connection. But Roberto and I believe that we owe our primary loyalty to ourselves and our own families. We owe it to our children to provide them with opportunities we never had, to give them access to social circles and financial resources that will open doors for them. The guests nodded sagely, as if Carmen were delivering profound wisdom rather than justifying her betrayal. The $5 million we each received wasn't just money, it was freedom. Freedom from guilt, freedom from obligation, freedom from a relationship that had become more about what we could give than what we received. And tonight, surrounded by friends who understand and support our choice,
We celebrate that freedom. The final toast was the most painful to witness. 30 people raising their glasses to honor my children's courage in abandoning me, treating their greed as if it were self-actualization, their cruelty as if it were personal growth. But as I sat in Victoria's chair, watching through her window, reading her journal of secret observations, I finally understood the full scope of her gift to me. She hadn't just left me money, she had revealed the truth about people I loved who didn't truly love me back. She had exposed the conditional nature of my children's affection before I could be devastated by it in more painful ways. The inheritance test hadn't been cruel. It had been merciful. After the last guest left and the restaurant fell quiet, Marcus knocked softly on the office door before entering. He found me still sitting in Victoria's chair, staring through the glass at the empty dining room where my children had celebrated their liberation from loving me. "Mrs. Rodriguez, are you all right?" I turned to look at him, this man who had been Victoria's partner in caring for me from a distance. "Marcus, how often did Victoria sit in this chair?" "Every time you came to the restaurant. Sometimes she would arrive hours early just to make sure everything was perfect for your visit. She would sit here the entire time, watching you enjoy your meals, taking notes about your preferences, making sure the staff understood how precious you are." Did she ever consider approaching me, just walking into the dining room and introducing herself? Marcus sat down in the chair beside me, his expression thoughtful. "Many times, especially after your husband died. She would sit here with her hand on the door handle, working up the courage to go to you. But she was terrified that her presence would disrupt the life you had built, the family relationships she thought were sustaining you. She was protecting me even then."
Rodriguez, Victoria spent 15 years studying your life, understanding your relationships, learning about the people you loved. She saw things about your children that you couldn't see because you loved them too much to recognize their selfishness. I looked back through the glass at the remnants of the liberation celebration. Empty wine bottles, scattered napkins, the detritus of a party that had celebrated my abandonment. I need to ask you something, Marcus. Tonight, when Carmen made that toast about family and loyalty, did any of that surprise you? Had Victoria predicted they would behave this way? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Rodriguez, Victoria had investigators monitor your children's financial activities, their social media, their conversations. She knew about their complaints regarding your financial limitations. She knew they viewed you as a potential burden rather than a beloved parent. The inheritance test wasn't designed to tempt good children into making a bad choice. It was designed to reveal the true character of children who had already mentally detached from you." "So she knew they would take the money?" "She hoped they wouldn't, but yes, she believed they would. And she believed that knowing their true nature would be kinder than discovering it gradually over years of increasing wealth and manipulation." I stood up from Victoria's chair and walked to the window, looking down at the dining room where I had shared so many happy meals with Miguel, where I had celebrated my children's achievements, where I had felt like our family was complete and loving. "Marcus, I want to understand something about tonight's dinner. Carmen and Roberto spent $20,000 celebrating their decision to abandon me. Where did that money come from?" "What do you mean?" $5 million is a significant amount, but it's not infinite. If they're spending at this level regularly, if they've upgraded their lifestyles to match their new wealth, how long will their windfall actually last? Marcus looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Rodriguez, that's not really my area of expertise." "But you have access to financial information about the restaurant's customers. You know their spending patterns, their payment methods. I'm not asking you to violate their privacy. I'm asking you to help me understand whether their celebration tonight was funded by prudent financial management or by people who are spending their inheritance faster than they should." The next morning, I met with James Morrison, my financial advisor, in his downtown office. I had asked him to conduct a discreet investigation into Carmen and Roberto's current financial situation, not for purposes of interference or manipulation, but to understand the long-term consequences of their choice to abandon me. James spread several documents across his conference table, his expression grim.
Mrs. Rodriguez, your children are in significant financial trouble. Within 6 months of receiving their inheritance payments, they've spent or committed nearly 60% of the money. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising given the lavish lifestyle changes I had observed, but the speed of their financial decline was shocking. How is that possible? $5 million should have lasted them years, even with significant lifestyle improvements. They made several immediate large purchases. Roberto bought a house in Scottsdale for $2.3 million. Carmen and Brad purchased a vacation home in Aspen for $1.8 million. Both families upgraded their cars, enrolled their children in exclusive private schools, joined country clubs, and began living as if the money were renewable rather than finite. James pulled out another document, a detailed analysis of their spending patterns. But the real problem is their ongoing expenses. Roberto's new house has property taxes and maintenance costs that exceed his engineering salary. Carmen's family has taken 6 international vacations in 5 months, spending an average of $40,000 per trip. They're both investing in business ventures they don't understand, losing money on stock picks recommended by friends rather than professionals. So they're running out of money? At their current rate of spending, Roberto will be financially insolvent within 18 months. Carmen's situation is slightly better because of Brad's real estate income, but even they will face serious cash flow problems within 2 years. I stared at the financial projections, trying to process the implications. My children had traded their relationship with me for money, that they were squandering through poor decisions and unsustainable lifestyle inflation. They had celebrated their liberation from family obligations by purchasing freedom they couldn't afford to maintain. James, what typically happens to people in their situation? People who come into sudden wealth and spend it irresponsibly? Usually bankruptcy. They'll be forced to sell the houses they bought, liquidate their investments at a loss, and return to approximately their previous financial status. But Mrs. Rodriguez, their situation will actually be worse than it was before the inheritance because they've accumulated new debts and financial obligations based on their temporarily elevated income. So they'll be worse off than they were when they worked normal jobs and lived in normal houses. Significantly worse off. And at that point, they typically attempt to reconcile with family members they've alienated, hoping for financial assistance to avoid complete financial ruin. The irony was breathtaking. Carmen and Roberto had abandoned me to avoid the burden of a poor mother, only to create circumstances that would eventually force them to seek help from the billionaire mother they had rejected. But the most painful realization was that their eventual financial desperation wouldn't represent genuine remorse for their betrayal. It would be another calculated decision based on their needs rather than their love. They would return to me not because they had learned to value our relationship, but because they would need access to my wealth to save themselves from the consequences of their own poor decisions. That afternoon, I returned to Victoria's study and pulled out the leather journal where she had recorded her observations of my life. I turned to a fresh page and began writing my own entry, documenting the liberation celebration I had witnessed and the financial investigation I had commissioned. As I wrote, I found myself thinking about the difference between Victoria's love and my children's love.
Victoria had spent 15 years watching over me from a distance, ensuring my happiness without expecting anything in return. She had protected me from knowledge that would have hurt me, provided for my comfort without seeking credit, and ultimately left me wealth that came with no conditions except the hope that I would use it wisely. Carmen and Roberto's love, by contrast, had always been conditional. They loved me when I enhanced their lives, when I provided babysitting and emotional support, when I celebrated their achievements and overlooked their selfishness. But when they were offered an alternative that served their interests better, they abandoned me without hesitation. The realization crystallized something important. I had been mourning the loss of a relationship that had never actually existed. The loving, devoted children I thought I had raised were figments of my own wishful thinking. The real Carmen and Roberto were people who viewed love as a transaction, family as a burden, and loyalty as a weakness to be overcome in pursuit of personal advancement. Victoria's gift hadn't just been money, it had been clarity.
She had revealed the truth about my children's character before I could be further damaged by their selfishness and manipulation. That evening, as I sat in the mansion's beautiful gardens watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, I received a phone call from David Ashworth. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I have some news that you need to know about. Carmen and Roberto's attorneys contacted my office today." My heart clenched, wondering if my children had somehow learned about my financial investigation or my presence at their celebration dinner. What did they want? They want to renegotiate the terms of their separation from you. Apparently, they've reconsidered their position and would like to explore the possibility of reconciliation. I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of sadness and resignation. Let me guess, they're having financial difficulties? I'm not privy to their personal circumstances, but their attorneys did mention that they're interested in discussing a more flexible arrangement that would allow for limited family contact while respecting everyone's boundaries. In other words, they want access to my money without the full responsibility of a genuine relationship. David Ashworth was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Rodriguez, what would you like me to tell them?" I looked out at the gardens Victoria had designed, at the mountains she had loved, at the life she had created and then shared with me. I thought about the liberation celebration where my children had toasted their freedom from loving me, and about the financial ruin they were creating for themselves through their poor decisions and inflated lifestyles. Tell them no, David. Tell them that some choices are permanent, some bridges can't be rebuilt, and some relationships can't be renegotiated. They made their decisions 6 months ago when they chose money over family. Now they can live with the consequences. Are you certain about this, Mrs. Rodriguez? They are still your children. No, David, they're Victoria's grandchildren, and she was wise enough to see them clearly when I was too blinded by love to recognize their selfishness. They celebrated their liberation from me 6 months ago. Now I'm celebrating my liberation from them. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced since learning about the inheritance test: peace. For the first time in my adult life, I was free from the burden of loving people who didn't truly love me back. I was free from the obligation to maintain relationships that had always been one-sided. I was free to discover who Elena Rodriguez could become when she wasn't defining herself through her role as a mother to ungrateful children. Victoria had spent 15 years watching over me from a distance, loving me without condition, protecting me without recognition. Now it was time for me to honor her legacy by learning to love myself with the same generosity and wisdom she had shown me. The sunset faded into twilight, and the first stars appeared over the mountains. Somewhere in the city below, Carmen and Roberto were probably discovering that their liberation celebration had been premature, that their freedom from family obligations came with a price they hadn't anticipated. But in Victoria's garden, surrounded by the beauty she had created and the love she had preserved for me, I was finally, truly, free. 2 years passed before I heard from Carmen and Roberto again, and when contact finally came, it arrived exactly as I had predicted. David Ashworth called on a Tuesday morning in March, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone delivering news he'd rather avoid. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I've received a formal request from your children's legal representatives. They're asking for an emergency meeting to discuss what they're calling urgent family matters." I was sitting in Victoria's sunroom, now truly my sunroom, reading through proposals for a new children's literacy foundation I was establishing in her memory. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me. As I planned to invest millions in helping other people's children learn to read, my own children were apparently ready to come begging for financial assistance. Let me guess, David, their urgent family matter involves money? I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics, but their attorneys did mention that Roberto has filed for bankruptcy and Carmen is facing foreclosure on both of her properties. The financial timeline had played out almost exactly as James Morrison had predicted. Roberto's expensive house in Scottsdale had become a millstone around his neck when property taxes, maintenance costs, and mortgage payments exceeded his engineering salary. Carmen's vacation home in Aspen had proven to be a luxury she couldn't afford to maintain, while her primary residence had been purchased with financing that assumed continued high income from sources that no longer existed. What exactly are they requesting?
They want to meet with you to discuss what they're calling a family reconciliation process. They've indicated a willingness to acknowledge past mistakes and work toward rebuilding your relationship. I set down the Literacy Foundation proposals and walked to the window overlooking the garden where Victoria had spent countless hours planning how to care for me from a distance. The desert landscape was in full spring bloom, with wildflowers painting the mountains in brilliant colors that reminded me of the beauty that was possible when you planted seeds in good soil and tended them with patience. David, do you remember what Carmen said about me 2 years ago when they declined my offer to meet? What were her exact words? I heard papers rustling as David consulted his files. Her attorney stated that she and Roberto were satisfied with their current circumstances and had no interest in pursuing a relationship with you under any conditions. And now their circumstances have changed, so their interest in a relationship has miraculously returned.
Mrs. Rodriguez, I can't speak to their motivations. I can only convey their request. I understood David's position, but I also understood something he couldn't see from his legal perspective. This wasn't a genuine attempt at reconciliation driven by love or regret. This was a calculated business decision made by people who had spent 2 years celebrating their liberation from family obligations, only to discover that liberation came with consequences they hadn't anticipated. Tell them no, David. Tell them that my circumstances haven't changed, so my interest in a relationship with them hasn't changed either. Mrs. Rodriguez, are you certain? They are requesting mediation, which suggests they might be willing to make substantial concessions to repair the relationship. The relationship was never broken, David. It was sold. They didn't make a mistake or have a momentary lapse in judgment. They made a calculated business decision to abandon me for money. Now they want to make another calculated business decision to return to me for more money. I'm not interested in being someone's financial contingency plan. 3 days later, Margaret Chen informed me that Carmen had attempted to make a reservation at Romano's Fine Dining, requesting the same private dining room where she had held her liberation celebration. Marcus had declined the reservation and informed her that she was no longer welcome at the restaurant. She became quite upset, Margaret reported during our weekly staff meeting. She claimed that family emergencies superseded any restaurant policies and demanded to speak with the owner. When Marcus explained that you were the owner, she became verbally abusive toward the staff. The incident revealed everything I needed to know about Carmen's mindset. Even in her desperate circumstances, even while seeking reconciliation, she still felt entitled to make demands, to override policies that inconvenienced her, to treat service workers poorly when they didn't immediately accommodate her wishes. The financial stress hadn't taught her humility or gratitude. It had simply made her more aggressive in pursuing what she wanted. But the most telling aspect of her behavior was her shock at learning I owned Romano's. After 2 years of no contact, she still thought of me as the poor mother she had abandoned, not as the wealthy woman who now controlled resources she desperately needed. She had made no effort to learn about my circumstances, to understand how my life had changed, or to consider that her actions might have consequences for her own future. A week later, Roberto made his own attempt at contact, calling my personal phone number, somehow obtained despite my instructions that all communication should go through David Ashworth. I was in the middle of reviewing architectural plans for a new wing of the Children's Hospital when my phone rang with a number I recognized but hadn't seen in 2 years. Mom, please don't hang up. I know we haven't talked, but I need you to listen to me for just 5 minutes. His voice carried a desperation I had never heard before, a raw panic that suggested his financial situation was even worse than the bankruptcy filings indicated. Against my better judgment, I found myself curious about what he would say, how he would frame his sudden need for the mother he had discarded when she seemed financially worthless. I'm listening, Roberto. Mom, I made a terrible mistake. We both did. When we took that money 2 years ago, we weren't thinking clearly. We were overwhelmed by financial stress and made a decision that we've regretted every day since. The lie came so smoothly that I almost admired his skill at rewriting history. There had been no financial stress 2 years ago. Carmen and Roberto had been comfortable, middle-class professionals with stable incomes and reasonable lifestyles. They had taken the money not out of desperation, but out of greed, choosing a windfall over their relationship with me because the windfall seemed more valuable. Roberto, what exactly have you regretted?
taking the money or spending it unwisely? There was a pause, and I could practically hear him recalibrating his approach. Both, Mom. Taking the money was wrong because it hurt you, and spending it the way we did was stupid because it put our families at risk. But the real mistake was cutting you out of our lives. Isabella and Diego ask about you all the time. They miss their grandmother. The mention of my grandchildren was a calculated emotional manipulation, but it also revealed how little Roberto understood about the changes in my life. Did he imagine I had spent 2 years pining for access to children whose parents had sold our relationship for money? Did he think I had been sitting alone in my small house, grieving for family gatherings I was no longer invited to attend? Roberto, if Isabella and Diego miss me, why didn't you bring them to visit? You could have maintained their relationship with me while honoring your decision to end yours. Another pause, longer this time. We thought it would be confusing for them. We didn't want them caught in the middle of adult decisions. You didn't want them to see how you had treated me. You didn't want to risk them asking questions about why their grandmother was no longer part of their lives. Mom, can we please just meet face to face, just the two of us? I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to try to make things right. I looked out at the garden where Victoria had planned so carefully for my future, where she had created beauty that would outlast her own life, where she had shown me what love looked like when it came without conditions or expectations. Roberto, what does making things right mean to you? It means acknowledging our mistakes, apologizing sincerely, and working to rebuild our relationship. It means putting family first the way we should have done in the beginning. And what about the money you received? Are you planning to return it as part of your apology?
The question hung in the air between us, and Roberto's silence provided the answer I had expected. He wanted reconciliation that came with financial assistance, not reconciliation that required him to make any meaningful sacrifices or amends. Mom, that money is gone. We made investments, bought houses, tried to build better lives for our families. Even if we wanted to return it, we couldn't. I see. So you want to apologize for taking money you can't return while asking for help with the financial problems caused by how you spent that money. Is that an accurate summary? Mom, you're making this sound worse than it is. We made mistakes, but we're still family. Family helps each other through difficult times. Roberto, when exactly did we become family again? Because 2 years ago, your attorney informed me that you had no interest in maintaining a family relationship under any circumstances. When did that change? It changed when we realized how much we missed you, how much the kids needed their grandmother, how much we needed our mother. It changed when you ran out of money. The bluntness of my response seemed to shock him into honesty, or at least a closer approximation of honesty than he had managed so far. Mom, yes, we're having financial difficulties. Yes, we made some poor decisions with the money we received, but that doesn't mean our desire to reconcile isn't genuine. Can't both things be true? Can't we genuinely miss you and also need your help? It was a fair question, and I considered it carefully before responding. Roberto, both things could theoretically be true, but the timing makes your sincerity questionable. You spent 2 years celebrating your liberation from family obligations. You hosted parties toasting your freedom from me. You told people that served and documented. He still thought of me as the isolated, powerless woman he had discarded, not as someone with the means to monitor his actions and understand his motivations. Roberto, I know a lot of things. I know that you and Carmen spent 6 months bragging to friends about how you had freed yourselves from the burden of a poor mother. I know that you used the money I unknowingly provided to purchase lifestyles you couldn't sustain. I know that you're now facing the consequences of financial irresponsibility and hoping that the mother you abandoned will rescue you from those consequences. Mom, where are you getting this information? Who's telling you these things? Does it matter? What matters is that your sudden interest in reconciliation coincides perfectly with your financial desperation. What matters is that you spent 2 years treating our severed relationship as a cause for celebration, and now you want to treat our potential reconciliation as a solution to your money problems.
Roberto's voice took on an edge of frustration that reminded me of the child he had been when he didn't get his way. Mom, what do you want from us? We made a mistake, we're admitting it, we're asking for forgiveness. What more can we do? Roberto, you can be honest about what you're actually asking for. You're not seeking forgiveness, you're seeking financial assistance. You're not interested in rebuilding our relationship, you're interested in accessing my resources. If you were genuinely remorseful about abandoning me, you would have reached out when you were still financially comfortable, when reconciliation couldn't benefit you materially. So, you're saying there's no chance, no possibility of working things out? I thought about Victoria's letters, about the love she had carried for me across 15 years of separation, about the sacrifices she had made to protect me from exactly this kind of manipulation. I thought about the liberation celebration where my children had toasted their freedom from loving me, and about the desperate phone calls now seeking to trade that freedom for access to my wealth. Roberto, there's always a possibility of genuine reconciliation between people who truly love each other, but that possibility requires honesty, sacrifice, and a willingness to prioritize relationship over personal benefit. Based on everything you've said today, I don't believe you're capable of that kind of love. Mom, please, just think about it. Think about Isabella and Diego, about the family we could still be. I am thinking about them, Roberto. I'm thinking about what it would teach them to watch their parents abandon their grandmother for money, spend that money irresponsibly, and then return begging for more when they faced consequences. I'm thinking about whether exposing them to parents who view family relationships as financial transactions would be healthy for their development. I ended the call without saying goodbye and immediately instructed Margaret Chen to have our security team monitor for any attempts by Carmen or Roberto to approach my properties. David Ashworth was notified that all further communication attempts should be declined without discussion or negotiation. That evening, I sat in Victoria's study, writing in the journal I had been keeping since her death, documenting the journey from abandoned mother to protected daughter to empowered woman. The entry for that day was brief. Roberto called seeking reconciliation and financial assistance, declined both. Some doors, once closed, should remain closed for the protection of everyone involved. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation that surprised me more than all of Carmen and Roberto's reconciliation attempts combined. The envelope was addressed to Mrs. Elena Rodriguez in careful handwriting, and the return address showed a name I didn't know, Isabella Martinez. Inside was an invitation to Isabella's quinceañera, my granddaughter's 15th birthday celebration.
The invitation was handmade, decorated with pressed flowers and written in Isabella's own careful script. At the bottom, she had added a personal note. Abuela Elena, I know things are complicated between you and my parents, but you're still my grandmother, and I miss you. I hope you'll come celebrate with me. Love, Isabella. The invitation broke my heart and filled it simultaneously. Isabella had reached out despite whatever her parents had told her about our estrangement, despite the 2 years of silence, despite the complicated adult decisions that had separated us. She had called me Abuela Elena, using the term of endearment I had taught her when she was small, acknowledging our relationship even when her parents had severed it. But the invitation also presented an impossible choice. Attending Isabella's quinceañera would mean seeing Carmen and Roberto, subjecting myself to their manipulation attempts, and potentially giving them false hope that their financial desperation had created an opening for reconciliation. Not attending would mean disappointing a child who had done nothing wrong, who was caught in the middle of adult conflicts she didn't understand. I called David Ashworth to discuss the legal and practical implications of any contact with my grandchildren. Mrs. Rodriguez, you have no legal obligation to maintain distance from Isabella and Diego. The separation agreement was between you and their parents, not between you and the children. But if I attend Isabella's party, won't Carmen and Roberto interpret that as an opening for renewed contact? Possibly, but that's a risk you can manage through clear communication and boundaries. You can make it clear that your presence is for Isabella, not for them. I spent 3 days considering the invitation, reading Isabella's note repeatedly,
remembering the little girl who used to beg me to read her stories and teach her to make empanadas. The child who had called me Abuela Elena was now 15, navigating her teenage years without the grandmother who had been arbitrarily removed from her life by parents who valued money more than family continuity. On the fourth day, I made my decision. I would attend Isabella's quinceañera, but I would do so in a way that honored her while protecting myself from her parents' manipulation. I called Marcus Romano and arranged for a private room at the restaurant where this entire journey had begun. I sent Isabella a beautiful handwritten response accepting her invitation, but explaining that I would be hosting my own small celebration for her at Romano's Fine Dining on the evening after her official party. I invited her to bring Diego and any friend she chose, but made it clear that the celebration was specifically for the young people in our family. Isabella called me directly 2 days later, her voice bright with excitement and gratitude. "Abuela Elena, thank you so much for planning something special for me. I can't wait to see you. I have so much to tell you about school and my friends and everything that's happened. I've missed you too, mija. I'm sorry we haven't been able to see each other for so long. I know it's because of something that happened between you and my parents, but I don't really understand what. All I know is that one day you were part of our family, and then you weren't, and no one would explain why." The pain in her voice confirmed what I had suspected. Carmen and Roberto had given their children no real explanation for my absence from their lives. They had simply erased me from family gatherings and hoped the children would stop asking questions. "Isabella, adult relationships are complicated sometimes. What matters is that you reached out to me and that we'll have a chance to celebrate your special day together." "Will my parents be invited to your party?" The question was innocent but loaded with implications. Isabella was trying to navigate the family dynamics she didn't understand, hoping perhaps that my presence might help repair whatever had gone wrong between her parents and me. "This celebration is just for you and Diego and your friends, mija. A special time for us to catch up and celebrate how much you've grown." "Oh, okay. That sounds really nice, Abuela Elena." The evening of Isabella's quinceañera party at Romano's was magical in ways I hadn't anticipated. She arrived wearing a beautiful pink dress, her dark hair styled in elaborate curls, looking so much like Carmen at that age that it took my breath away. Diego, now 13, had grown tall and lanky, his voice changing and his manner more reserved than the little boy I remembered. But what touched me most was Isabella's obvious joy at seeing me again. She hugged me tightly, holding on longer than teenage girls usually do, as if she were trying to make up for 2 years of missed embraces. Diego was more hesitant initially, but warmed up quickly when I asked about his soccer team and his favorite classes. Isabella had invited 3 close friends, girls who treated the private dining room at Romano's like the most elegant venue they had ever experienced. They took photos with the beautiful table settings, sampled the gourmet appetizers with wide eyes, and chatted excitedly about school gossip and teenage drama that reminded me of the simple pleasures of youth. As the evening progressed, I found myself falling back into the role of grandmother with an ease that surprised me. I listened to Isabella's stories about her classes, her friends, her dreams of studying marine biology in college. I watched Diego's face light up when he talked about his soccer team making the playoffs, about the science fair project he was working on, about the books he had been reading. These children carried no responsibility for their parents' choices. They had been innocent victims of adult conflicts they didn't understand, deprived of their grandmother's presence because their parents had valued money more than family continuity. But I also noticed things that concerned me. Diego mentioned that his family had moved to a smaller house, that his parents had been stressed about work for the past year, and that some of their family traditions had been discontinued due to budget changes. Isabella spoke carefully about her parents' moods, using the diplomatic language of a teenager who had learned to navigate adult tension without fully understanding its source. My grandchildren were experiencing the consequences of their parents' poor financial decisions, watching their comfortable lifestyle erode while not understanding why. They had lost not only their grandmother, but also the security and stability their parents' windfall was supposed to provide. Near the end of the evening, as Diego stepped away to use the restroom, Isabella moved her chair closer to mine and spoke in a low, serious voice. Isabella, can I ask you something personal? Of course, mija. Are you really poor? My parents used to say things about how you couldn't afford nice things, about how we needed to be careful not to ask you for expensive gifts or expect you to take us places that cost money. But this restaurant is really fancy, and you seem different than I remember. More confident, I guess. The question revealed that Carmen and Roberto had been positioning me as financially inadequate even before they abandoned me, preparing their children to view me as a grandmother whose love came with financial limitations.
They had been managing expectations about what I could provide while simultaneously viewing me as a burden they would eventually need to support. Isabella, your parents' understanding of my circumstances wasn't completely accurate. I'm comfortable now, able to do things and go places that I couldn't afford when you were younger. So, you're not poor anymore? No, mija, I'm not poor anymore. Isabella absorbed this information with the seriousness that comes naturally to teenagers who are trying to understand the adult world around them. Is that why my parents don't talk to you anymore? Because they thought you were poor and then found out you weren't? The perceptiveness of her question took my breath away. At 15, Isabella had intuited something about her parents' character that had taken me 65 years to fully understand. Isabella, adult relationships involve many factors. What's important is that you and I can have our own relationship, regardless of whatever happened between me and your parents. I'd like that, Abuela Elena. I've missed you a lot. When the evening ended and I hugged my grandchildren goodbye, Isabella whispered in my ear, "Can we do this again sometime, even if my parents don't approve?" "We'll see what we can arrange, mija." 2 weeks later, I established college funds for both Isabella and Diego, managed through David Ashworth's firm, with instructions that the children should be informed about the funds when they turned 18. The money would provide them with complete freedom to pursue higher education without depending on their parents' financial circumstances or decisions. I also arranged for Marcus Romano to extend standing invitations to Isabella and Diego for monthly dinners at the restaurant, with transportation provided if necessary. Margaret Chen was instructed to monitor their academic progress and provide any support they might need for school-related expenses or activities. My grandchildren would not suffer for their parents' choices. They would have opportunities, resources, and support that didn't depend on Carmen and Roberto's financial stability or character. When they came of age, they would understand that family love could exist without conditions, that loyalty was a gift rather than an obligation, that some relationships grow stronger when they're protected from toxic influences. Carmen and Roberto eventually lost their houses, declared bankruptcy, and returned to modest lifestyles that matched their actual incomes rather than their inflated expectations. They made several more attempts to contact me, each one more desperate than the last, each one more transparently motivated by financial need rather than genuine remorse. I never responded to their appeals, but I kept informed about their circumstances through discreet monitoring. They learned to live within their means again, found steady employment, and slowly rebuilt their financial stability through hard work rather than windfalls. The experience taught them lessons about money management and lifestyle inflation that they should have learned before squandering their inheritance. But what they never learned was the cost of selling relationships for money, the permanent damage caused by treating love as a transaction, the irreversible nature of trust once it's been deliberately destroyed. Isabella graduated valedictorian of her high school class and accepted a full scholarship to study marine biology at Stanford University. Diego was recruited by 3 different colleges for soccer and chose the school with the best engineering program. Both of them understood, when they reached 18, that their grandmother had been caring for them from a distance, ensuring their futures were secure regardless of their parents' mistakes. Today, Isabella calls me every Sunday to share stories about her research projects and her dreams of protecting ocean ecosystems. Diego sends me photos from his soccer games and updates about his engineering studies. They visit me during school breaks, bring their friends to Romano's for celebration dinners, and treat Victoria's mansion as a second home where they're always welcome.
My grandchildren learned that real love doesn't disappear when circumstances change, doesn't demand payment for its continuance, doesn't punish children for their parents' failures. They learned that family can be chosen as well as inherited, that loyalty is a gift rather than an obligation, that some relationships grow stronger when they're protected from toxic influences. Carmen and Roberto also learned lessons, though not the ones they expected. They learned that $5 million wasn't enough money to sustain a lifetime of poor decisions. They learned that abandoning family relationships has consequences that extend beyond immediate financial gain. They learned that their children's love for their grandmother couldn't be controlled or manipulated the way their own love had been conditioned and sold. Most importantly, they learned that some choices are permanent, some bridges can't be rebuilt, and some relationships can't be renegotiated once they've been deliberately destroyed for money. As for me, I learned that Victoria's greatest gift wasn't the billions of dollars she left me, though that wealth has allowed me to live with freedom and purpose I never imagined possible. Her greatest gift was the clarity to see my children's true character before I could be further damaged by their selfishness and manipulation. I learned that being abandoned by people who never truly loved me was actually a form of liberation, freeing me to discover relationships based on genuine affection rather than obligation or need. I learned that family can be created through choice and consistency rather than genetics and proximity. And I learned that the waiter at Romano's Fine Dining who whispered, "Your table is ready, Mrs. Billionaire," wasn't announcing my financial status. He was welcoming me home to a life where I would be finally valued for who I was, rather than what I could provide. The table was indeed ready. Ready for authentic relationships, purposeful philanthropy, and the kind of love that Victoria had modeled, generous, protective, and unconditional. Ready for a life where every decision came from strength rather than desperation, where every relationship was chosen rather than inherited, where every day offered opportunities to honor the woman who had loved me from a distance until I was wise enough to love myself up close. Victoria's love had prepared a place for me at the table of true wealth, not just money, but peace, purpose, and the freedom to choose who deserved a seat at the table of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.